3 massive excavators were parked in my driveway, their mechanical arms swinging with deadly precision, tearing apart the building I had poured my heart into. The concrete slab was still there, but the walls and roof gone, completely leveled. My tools, my memories, everything I'd worked so hard for vanished. I stood frozen, my duffel bag at my feet, heart pounding. What the hell, I muttered under my breath, still trying to process what I was seeing. I had just returned from a grueling 10-month deployment overseas, still tasting the jet fuel in my mouth as I pulled into my driveway on a Monday morning. All I wanted was a good night's sleep in my own bed and to finally see the workshop I'd spent 5 years building behind my house. The place where I'd crafted furniture, repaired old tools for the neighbors, and found peace when the world outside felt like chaos. But nothing could prepare me for what I saw. That's when I heard the sound of heels clicking down the sidewalk behind me, like the rhythmic steps of someone who knew they had all the answers. I turned and saw her, Harriet Thompson, the president of the HOA, a bleach blonde bob, a pink cardigan, and a clipboard clutched tightly in her hands like it was a weapon. "Oh, you're back early," she said, flashing a smile like she'd just won a raffle. "Where's my workshop?" I demanded, trying to keep my voice steady, but it was clear from her expression that she had no idea what she had just destroyed. Harriet Thompson didn't seem fazed at all as she stood there, clipboard in hand, her smile wide and smug. The sight of her made my stomach turn. She wasn't even trying to hide the satisfaction in her eyes, looking me up and down like she hadn't just overseen the demolition of my entire workshop. Harriet's gaze flicked over the empty concrete slab where my building had once stood, then back to me. "Oh, that old thing," she said, as though the years of sweat and work I'd put into it meant nothing. "Yes, we had it removed. It was in violation of community standards." I blinked, processing her words. My mind was racing. "You demolished my building while I was deployed. Are you serious?" She waved a hand dismissively. "You didn't respond to our letters," she said, the words dripping with condescension. "You were in Iraq." "Yes, well, that's not really an excuse for ignoring the HOA's correspondence now, is it?" I felt a wave of disbelief wash over me. I could feel my blood pressure rising, but I kept my voice level. "You tore down a permitted structure. Do you even know how illegal that is?" Her smile faltered, but she quickly regained her composure. "It's not illegal if the HOA board approves it," she said, her voice growing defensive. And the board voted unanimously. Right after the tense encounter with Harriet, I started receiving constant warnings from the HOA about minor violations. Every day, another letter showed up, each one listing a new reason I was supposedly violating the community rules. The first letter was about the grass in my yard, growing too high over the allowable height by about 1.5 inches. I couldn't help but laugh and tear it up immediately. Next came the second letter, this time about my parking. They said I had parked my car out of bounds, even though I always parked exactly where I was supposed to. Another ridiculous reason. These violations might seem small, but I soon realized they weren't just about the grass or where I parked. They were a warning, a signal that they were watching, and if I didn't comply, they wouldn't stop at just one letter. A few days later, I noticed a large truck parked at the end of the street, parked just far enough to observe my house. It wasn't obvious, but it felt like they were keeping an eye on me, waiting for the next excuse to make another violation claim. I couldn't be sure, but I could feel it, they were watching. Then one morning, Lewis, my retired neighbor, came over to visit. He's a quiet guy, but today, he had a worried look on his face. "I heard about what happened," he said, motioning to the letter I had just ripped up. "The HOA's been doing the same thing to me. They wanted me to take down a tree out front once. Same type of thing." I looked at him, feeling a sense of solidarity. Lewis was one of the few people who had stood up to the HOA before. He knew what it was like to go head-to-head with them. I had a feeling that I wasn't alone in this fight, but no one else seemed brave enough to speak out. People were scared, but I wasn't going to stay silent any longer. The next day, I decided I couldn't just sit around. I called Amanda Greer, my lawyer, to figure out my legal options. Amanda was sharp, and she had handled her fair share of cases against corrupt organizations. After I explained what had been happening, she looked at me seriously. "If they really tore down your property without proper approval, that's potentially a case of destruction of property," she said. "But we need to dig deeper. Let's see if they followed the rules." After some research, Amanda suggested we check the HOA meeting minutes. "We need to see if the board actually approved the demolition," she said. "If they did, it could be easier to prove your case." What came next wasn't what I expected. As Amanda dug into the HOA's finances, she uncovered something even more troubling. The payment for the demolition wasn't recorded properly. It looked like the HOA had used discretionary maintenance funds to pay the contractor without proper authorization. "This doesn't add up," Amanda said, flipping through the financial records. There's no receipt, no breakdown, just a lump sum paid to this company. This could be a sign of embezzlement. What was worse, Amanda found that the contractor who had torn down my workshop had no real documentation backing up the payment. This wasn't just a simple mistake, it was potentially a financial crime. I was in shock. Not only had they destroyed my property, but now they were possibly mishandling HOA funds. This wasn't just an HOA overstep, it was looking more and more like a scam. As I began talking to more neighbors, I realized I wasn't the only one who had been pushed around by the HOA. Lewis, Marcy, and a few others started sharing their stories with me, how they'd been fined for things as trivial as mailbox colors or the wrong shade of a fence. The more I listened, the more I realized the HOA had been taking advantage of the whole neighborhood for years. But this was different. They had crossed a line by destroying my workshop, and I wasn't going to let it slide. Marcy, who lived a few houses down, came to my door a few days later, holding a binder in her hand. "I thought you might want to see this," she said, looking more serious than I'd ever seen her. Inside the binder were letters, emails, and complaints from several residents who had been fined, harassed, and treated unfairly by the HOA. The more I flipped through the pages, the more I saw the same pattern: HOA, overreach, unnecessary fines, and a general abuse of power. "This is theft," Marcy said quietly, looking at me. "They've been taking money from people for nothing, but what they did to you, this is different. This is criminal." I couldn't believe it. But I knew she was right. The more I uncovered, the more it seemed like the HOA had been getting away with corruption for far too long. Now, they had messed with the wrong person. I was going to make sure they paid for it. By the end of the week, things had escalated quickly. I'd started collecting enough evidence to show that the HOA had acted illegally, but I had no idea how deep the corruption ran. The documents I pulled from the county office made it clear that the HOA wasn't just mishandling my workshop. They were involved in something far more serious. I dug through the financial records of the HOA and found a payment to Silver Pines Property Services, the company that had demolished my workshop. At first I thought it was just an ordinary payment, but then I noticed something strange. There was no itemized breakdown for the payment, just a lump sum for emergency repairs. I knew the HOA didn't have the authority to approve such expenses without community input, so I started digging deeper. When I looked into the contractor further, I realized Silver Pines had been registered just a few months ago, and the owner was none other than Harriet's nephew. That was when everything clicked. Harriet had used her position to funnel HOA funds to her family. The more I uncovered, the more it felt like a coordinated effort to manipulate the entire community for personal gain. But the worst part came when I discovered more illegal activity. Payments had been made to other contractors with no documentation, and the HOA had been covering it all up with fabricated paperwork. This wasn't just a petty scam, it was a full-blown conspiracy. I couldn't let it slide. The next step was to contact the authorities. I reached out to Detective Carla Nguyen at the sheriff's office, hoping she could help me bring this corruption to light. When she came over to my place to review the evidence, she didn't mince words. "This is bad," she said, after going through the HOA's financials. "They've been using HOA funds illegally for personal gain. This is fraud." Carla immediately began looking into the HOA's financial records, and the more she dug, the worse it got. It wasn't just about the payment for the demolition of my workshop. She found that over $70,000 had been funneled to Silver Pines over the past 6 months, all labeled as emergency repairs. But there were no receipts, no documentation, nothing to justify the expenses. "We'll get a warrant to pull their full records," Carla said, her tone growing serious. "But this is looking like much more than just financial mismanagement. They've been covering their tracks for months." I was angry, but I knew that exposing this corruption would take more than just a few documents. We needed hard proof. Carla and her team began preparing to get warrants for the HOA's financials, hoping to find more evidence of the scheme. But I could tell that the deeper we went, the more dangerous this was becoming for Harriet and her cronies. The worst part was that it wasn't just about the money. As we continued our investigation, it became clear that Harriet wasn't just taking money from the HOA's funds. She was manipulating the entire system to protect her family's business interests and line their pockets. This wasn't just about my workshop anymore. It was about exposing everything she'd done. As the investigation continued, I knew it was only a matter of time before the truth came out. And once it did, there would be no turning back for the HOA or Harriet. The authorities were getting closer, but I knew I had to do my part to make sure the community knew exactly what had been going on. I started gathering my neighbors, people like Lewis, who had been subjected to harassment from the HOA for years, and Marcy, who had come forward with information about HOA's shady dealings. I made sure they had copies of everything I had uncovered, from the fake invoices to the documents showing the fraudulent payments. The next HOA meeting was scheduled for Saturday afternoon, and I wasn't going to let it pass without confronting Harriet and the board. I wasn't just fighting for my workshop anymore. I was fighting for everyone in the community who had been manipulated and taken advantage of by the HOA. When I arrived at the community clubhouse, the room was filled with tense energy. Harriet was already at the head of the table, flanked by Ron and Marcia, the board members who had been complicit in the scheme. The moment I walked in, I could see the color drain from Harriet's face. She knew something was coming. "I'm here today to make sure you all understand exactly what's been happening in this community," I said, standing at the front of the room. "You've all been lied to, and today the truth is coming out." I laid out everything I had found, the illegal payments, the forged documents, and the shady dealings. The room fell silent as I went through the evidence piece by piece. Harriet's face went pale, and she fidgeted nervously with her papers. When I finished, I turned to the rest of the community. "This isn't just about my workshop. This is about all of us. We've all been taken advantage of, and it's time we stand up and do something about it." The tension in the room was palpable. For the first time in a long time, people were starting to speak up. One by one, neighbors who had been silent for years started sharing their stories of how they'd been mistreated by the HOA. Fines for no reason, threats for minor violations, and harassment for speaking out. But then, the worst part came. I dropped the final piece of evidence, the payments to Silver Pines, the money funneled directly into Harriet's family's business. I could see the board members squirming in their seats. The truth was undeniable. "We have the receipts. We have the proof. This is over," I said, my voice steady. The moment I entered the HOA meeting, I knew things were about to change. Harriet was sitting at the head of the table, her usual calm demeanor replaced by tight, anxious eyes. Ron and Marcia, the two board members most closely aligned with her, were visibly uncomfortable, shifting in their seats. The tension was palpable. "I'm here to make sure you understand exactly what's been happening in this community," I said, my voice cutting through the thick air. "You've all been lied to. Today, the truth is coming out." Harriet's face went pale as she glanced nervously at the others. I could feel her trying to maintain control, but I wasn't backing down. "I've gathered evidence, proof of fraud, cover-ups, illegal payments, and more." I continued, pacing slowly in front of the table. "You've been manipulating the system for your own gain, and I won't let it slide any longer." Harriet opened her mouth to speak, but I didn't give her the chance. "I'm not here to listen to excuses," I snapped. "This is the end." The room fell silent, the only sound, the faint rustling of papers as Harriet's grip on the situation crumbled. For the first time, the entire room could see her true colors. I set the documents down one by one. First, the invoice for the demolition of my workshop marked as emergency repairs with no proper breakdown of costs. I watched as several people in the room gasped. Next, I laid out more evidence, payments made to Silver Pines Property Services, Harriet's nephew's company, with no receipts, no transparency. "This is where the money went," I said, pointing at the papers. "And here's the kicker. Harriet's nephew pocketed HOA funds under the guise of repairs." The murmurs began to grow louder, and I could see the faces of the other board members change. Their eyes darted between each other, their nervous glances betraying their guilt. The rest of the room was beginning to piece things together. But I wasn't finished. I pulled out the email thread where Harriet had tried to backdate a zoning notice for my workshop. "This is obstruction of justice," I said, slamming the printout onto the table. "You tried to falsify government records to cover up your crimes." Harriet's mouth went dry. She couldn't form words. The room was in shock as I laid out everything, the illegal payments, the fake records, the fraudulent contractor deals. Harriet stood up, her face flushed with desperation. "You don't know what you're talking about," she spat, but her words were empty. Just then, a sheriff's deputy entered, followed by two more officers. He stepped forward and addressed the room. "We've got a warrant for the HOA's financials. It's over, Harriet." She froze her eyes wide with disbelief as the deputy approached her. For the first time, her confidence shattered. "You can't do this," she protested weakly, but there was no fight left in her. I watched as the officers cuffed her and led her out of the room, the rest of the board members, now silent and defeated. The community erupted into applause. People who had suffered for so long under her rule were finally able to breathe again. I turned to the crowd, my voice steady. "This is what happens when we stand up, when we demand justice." The fight wasn't over, but in that moment, I knew we had won. The news of Harriet's arrest spread quickly, and the mood in the neighborhood shifted almost overnight. For the first time in years, there was an air of freedom that hadn't been felt in the community. People started speaking up, sharing their experiences of how they'd been targeted by the HOA, fined for the smallest things, harassed for no reason. The oppressive grip of the HOA was finally gone. As I walked down the street, I could see neighbors talking to each other more openly. Lewis came by a few days after the meeting, and for the first time in a long while, he had a genuine smile on his face. "It feels different now," he said, looking around at the street, "like everyone's waking up." I couldn't help but agree. The tension that had hung over us for so long was gone. People were finally feeling empowered, and I knew it wasn't just about my workshop. It was about everyone in this community regaining their voice. For once they knew they could stand up to the HOA and win. The legal aftermath hit fast. Harriet's arrest made the front pages, and the town buzzed with disbelief. The charges were serious: wire fraud, falsifying records, and misappropriating HOA funds. It was clear this wasn't just a matter of illegal demolition, it was a full-scale financial crime. The rest of the board didn't escape unscathed. Marcia, who had been signing off on fraudulent payments, cooperated with the investigation and received a reduced sentence. Ron, however, tried to distance himself from Harriet's actions, but his involvement was clear. The HOA was completely overhauled. Marcy, a neighbor I trusted, was voted in as the new president. One of the first things she did was implement a policy for full financial transparency, no more hidden meetings, no more secretive votes. The community felt the relief of knowing the corrupt system was no more. The change was palpable. No longer would residents be subject to fines for imaginary infractions or live in fear of the HOA's control. The real change, though, came at the neighborhood barbecue a few weeks later. It wasn't a big flashy event, just a simple gathering to celebrate the end of the HOA's reign. The park was filled with families, kids running around freely, people talking openly without fear of being watched. For the first time in a long while, it felt like a real community. I spent most of the evening at the grill, chatting with my neighbors, enjoying the sense of peace that had settled in. The neighborhood was breathing again. People planted gardens, kids played, without being threatened by fines, and there was laughter in the air. As the sun set, Amanda called me with the latest update. The DOJ's pursuing federal charges for wire fraud, too. They traced about $130,000. Harriet's looking at serious prison time. I stepped outside and looked up at the stars, taking it all in. Not only was my workshop rebuilt, but so was the community. We had all reclaimed our power, and for the first time, it felt like things would stay that way. I spent the next few months slowly filling my workshop with new tools and projects, but it wasn't just about what I was building. It was about what we had all rebuilt together. The community was stronger now, more united, and that, more than anything, was the real victory. Looking back, the win wasn't about the victory itself, it was the process. If I'd let anger dictate my actions, things could have turned out very differently. But sticking to the legal path, letting the evidence do the talking, that's what made the difference. Following the law, not rage, changed everything. Standing up doesn't mean escalating things with emotions or violence. I could have acted impulsively, but that wouldn't have gotten me anywhere. The legal route, focusing on the facts, is what truly worked. It was about evidence, not anger. For anyone facing similar situations, keep good records and pay attention to public filings. They often tell you more than you think. And if things get serious, don't hesitate to get legal help. Professionals can guide you through it without losing control. Communities thrive when people respect the law. HOA power exists only when it's unchecked. When we stand up legally, we can dismantle that power. Just like my workshop, it wasn't the tools that mattered, it was the solid foundation that kept everything in place.